Chapter 5. Malawi Begins to Starve. Part of the answer arrived in late September. Not long after taking our final exams, Gilbert and I went to the trading center to play a few games of Bawo. As we walked back to his house, I noticed something odd. About a dozen people were gathered in his yard, talking in low, worried voices. They were mostly women, each wearing brightly colored headscarves like my own mother and carrying an empty basket. "Who are these people?" I asked. "They have run out of food in the far villages," Gilbert said. "These women have come to ask my father for handouts or ganyu. Some of them walked for days." Ganyu was another word for day labor, or a small job such as clearing fields or digging ridges for a little money or food. It's how many farmers in Malawi made a living when times were hard, but I'd never seen this many people at once. "What's your father going to do?" I said. "He's going to feed them," Gilbert answered. "He has no choice. He's their chief." What Gilbert said was true. The drought had destroyed all of the crops in the countryside, and the families in the smaller villages had run out of food. Their storage rooms were empty, and now they were hungry. I came home and told my father what I'd just witnessed. He'd also seen the lines of women, but didn't seem too concerned. He explained that the government always kept giant stocks of maize for emergencies. In tough times like these, they sold it on the market for a reduced price so that everyone could afford to eat. "Don't worry," he said. "Whatever the case may be, our family has never gone hungry." A few days later, however, my father returned from the trading center where a group of farmers had had a rally. They delivered some terrible news. A few dishonest men in the government had sold our emergency maize and taken off with the money. "They're saying there's nothing left," he told my mother. "This year will be a disaster." My mother's face seemed stricken. "Oh my God, only God can help us," she whispered. After that, hunger came to Malawi. Due to the shortage of maize, the price doubled in the market. When this happened, people started hunting for food in the forest. One evening before dinner, I was feeling a bit hungry, so I walked next door to see if I could snatch a few mangoes from Mr. Mwawile's tree. When I arrived, he and his family were sitting down to steaming plates of food. "Just in time," I said. But when I looked closer, I realized that the Mwalis were eating pumpkin leaves and stewed green mangoes. They weren't even ripe, and I'm sure they tasted awful. "You'll find no food here," Mr. Mwali said, wrinkling his nose as he chewed. Later, I saw several men digging ridges in Malawi's field for ganyu. They were from the outer villages, and each walked away carrying a handful of those same green mangoes. A few days later, walking through the trading center, I saw something else I'd never seen. Women had spread out plastic tarps and were selling gaga. Gaga are the clear-colored outer layers, or chaff, that are removed from the maize kernels in the mill. It's mostly garbage, left on the mill floor and tossed away. Farmers fed it to their chickens and pigs. I like to use gaga in my bird traps, but I'd never seen people eat it. Yet here it was selling in the market for 300 kwacha a pail, 3 times what it normally cost. A group of women held metal buckets and crowded around the sellers, pushing one another to get some. "Move away, I was here first." "We're all hungry, sister. There are no firsts in that." When I returned an hour later, all the gaga was gone. Right then I felt a shock pass through me, as if someone had shaken me awake in the night. I started running home. Until then, I hadn't worried much about our own situation. Being 13 years old and always hungry explained some of that. Each meal, I'd stick out my plate and ask for seconds, saying, "That's right, keep it coming." Sure, I knew about the problems throughout the country, but for some reason, I always assumed they were happening to someone else. Now, as I headed home, I grew more and more afraid. When I reached our house and opened the door to the storage room, I nearly fainted. Only 2 bags of grain remained. In my mind, they were already gone. I started doing the hunger math. 2 bags of maize wouldn't last 2 months. In 3 months, we'd be starving. Worse, there were still 210 days, about 7 months, until our next harvest. We hadn't even planted 1 seed, and once we did plant, there was no guarantee that it would rain or that we'd even have fertilizer. A few days later, my father started rounding up our goats to sell in the market. In Malawi, your animals are your most prized possessions, a farmer's only token of wealth and class. Now we were trading them for a few pails of maize. The men who ran the Kanyenya stands selling fried meat had enormous power now. The prices they offered for goats, pigs, and cows went lower each day, yet people still lined up to sell. I noticed one of the goats was Mankalila, one of my favorites. Unlike the other goats, he loved to play. He'd let me grab his horns and wrestle in the courtyard. He and Kamba had also become friends and would chase each other around the kitchen, irritating my mother. "Papa, why are you selling our goats?" I asked. He turned to me. "A week ago, the price was 500. Now it's 400. I'm sorry, William, but if we wait any longer, we'll get nothing." The goats were tied by the legs with rope and already crying. Kamba heard the commotion and came to investigate. When he saw Mankalala being led down the trail with the others, he started to bark and jump. Mankalala then turned around as if to plead for help. He knew his fate, but as much as it hurt me inside, I had to watch him go. What could I do? My family had to eat. In early November, I started waking up as usual at 4 a.m. to make my ridges. On the first morning, when I walked inside to have my breakfast, my father met me in the darkness. "No fallout today?" he said. "Huh? It's time to start cutting back. We need to save our food." By this time, our supply of mice was just 1.5 bags. Breakfast was the first to go, and I wondered what would be next. But instead of complaining, I drank a big cup of water, grabbed my hoe, and went to meet Jeffrey in the fields. I told him about skipping breakfast. "Can you believe it?" I asked, but my cousin simply shrugged. "You're just starting that today?" he said. "I haven't had breakfast in 2 weeks. I'm getting used to it." In the early morning, the weather was still cool, and I could dig my ridges with great energy, but by 7 a.m. my stomach had woken up and realized it was empty. It growled and rumbled and demanded to be filled. Soon the sun was high in the sky and sucking all of my strength. The only thing keeping me awake was my father, marching past. "Make those ridges better," he shouted. "But I'm too hungry, Papa." "Think about next year's harvest, son. Try your best." It was true. My ridges looked crooked, as if a slithering snake had dug them. Across the field, Jeffrey was hard at work. "Mr. Jeffrey," I called out, "you dig my ridges today, and I'll dig yours tomorrow. Can we make this deal?" "I'll think about it," he said, gasping for breath. "But it sounds like the same deal as yesterday." I was trying to raise my cousin's spirits. Ever since his father died, he hadn't been the same. He looked sad, and sometimes he stayed in his room for an entire day and didn't speak to anyone. He was also sickly. At a recent trip to the clinic, the doctor said he had anemia, which is caused by not having a healthy diet. I later discovered that breakfast wasn't the only thing Jeffrey was skipping. Food was running low all around. "I'm joking," I shouted, "but seriously, man, you don't look good. Take a break and get some rest." "I have no choice," he said, swinging his hoe. "You know my deal." I also knew that Jeffrey wouldn't be returning to school in the next term. Because of the drought and losing her husband, Jeffrey's mother didn't have the money to pay his school fees. And anyway, she needed Jeffrey and his brother Jeremiah to work and provide food. That day I pretended not to know. "Soon your man Kamkwamba will be in secondary school, where he belongs," I said, "wearing trousers and walking tall." "He'll find us there," Jeffrey said. "We older boys have plans for Kamkwamba." "You can't touch him." "Oh, you wait and see." Jeffrey wasn't the only one changing. Kamba was also slowing down. I'd always known that his best years were behind him, back when he lived on the estate, but now his age was starting to show, and ever since the drought, he'd grown thinner. The food I was feeding him at night just wasn't enough, I guess. As he got slower, the mice in the fields outwitted him, and other dogs beat him to the scraps in the garbage piles. Kamba no longer chased chickens around the courtyard, but stayed in the shade and slept. I was beginning to see his ribs. One night, when I tossed up a ball of nisma for him to eat, he lost sight of it, and it landed right on his head. "What's the problem, old man?" I teased. He leaned over and sucked down the food in one gulp. Some things didn't change.